The November pavement is wet. The city is quiet around us. We have just walked out of a restaurant where she finally said the words I have been waiting 4 years to hear, and now Vera Hollis, CEO, the most controlled person I have ever shared a building with, has stopped walking. She turns. She reaches up. Her palm settles against my jaw, warm, certain, the way she touches things she intends to keep. I have spent 3 long years cataloging her small tells, the jaw flex, the half-second pause, the tea brought without asking. Now she is looking at me with nothing managed, nothing contained. She says, I think you know. The only question is how we got here. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. 3 years is long enough to learn a person. Not all of them. Not the versions they show everyone. But if you spend 3 years occupying the professional orbit of someone like Vera Hollis, attending her meetings, managing her calendar, sitting across from her in client decks and conference rooms, and Tuesday morning strategy sessions, you eventually accumulate a library of details nobody else is cataloging. Small things, precise things. The kind of data you do not realize you have been collecting until you are lying in a hotel room at 2 in the morning, accounting for the specific weight of 2 fingers on your jaw. I had joined Hollis Meridian Partners 6 years ago as a research analyst, straight from a postgraduate program in organizational behavior that Vera had tracked through her graduate school network and decided was worth a call. She had called me herself. Not an assistant, not a recruiter. Vera, on a Tuesday evening in October, with that voice that managed to make a job offer sound like a surgical assessment. You understand how organizations fail from the inside, she had said. That is a skill most people do not develop until it is too late to use properly. I had accepted because the job was excellent and because something in the way she said that sentence made me believe she was right, and I was not yet sure what to do with a person who could make me believe things that quickly. 6 years later, I was her associate director and the closest thing she had to a chief of staff. I sat in rooms she did not have time to sit in. I translated her decisions into language the organization could use. I managed the gap between the version of Vera that the firm needed and the version the clients got, which was a meaningful gap and a full-time exercise. I also managed the version of myself that had been slowly becoming impossible to maintain since sometime in the 2nd year. Vera Hollis was 39 years old and had built the firm from a 2-person operation in a shared office to a team of 42, with a client list that included names the business press checked in on annually. She was not warm in the way people use the word to describe women they like. She was specific. She was complete in her attention. She noticed things people did not notice they were doing, and she used that noticing exclusively to make better decisions, which was more useful and more unsettling than warmth. She was also, in ways that had become increasingly difficult to file under the professional category I had been storing them in, the most compelling person I had ever shared an address with. I had managed this with the same efficiency I brought to everything: the calendar, the client relationships, the quarterly deliverables, the impossible Tuesday meetings. I managed it by being professional and slightly irreverent and very good at my job, which were 3 things she valued, and which gave me a working container for the 4th thing I was not going to name. The Revance offsite was Philippa's idea. Philippa Ong had been with the firm for 11 years, which made her the institutional memory of everything Vera had built before I arrived. She was 51, and had the particular authority of a woman who had survived everything this industry could produce, and had decided to stop pretending she hadn't. She was the person in the firm who said the plainest things, and she had been saying them to Vera since before the firm had a 4th-floor conference room, and Vera took them with the resigned grace of someone who had long since stopped arguing that the plainest things weren't true. Philippa's idea was this: the Revance restructuring was at a stage where the client needed to feel the thinking, not just receive it. 3 days at their regional conference center, the full strategy team, live sessions, working dinners. Show them we are in the room with them. The team for the offsite was 5 people: Vera, Philippa, me, Teo Marsh, the junior analyst who had the specific genius of people who had not yet learned to be strategic about what they said out loud, and Kala Reed, our data lead, who spoke exclusively in clean sentences and had the organizational gift of making the abstract legible. I had booked 5 rooms at the hotel. The hotel, when we arrived on a Sunday evening in November, had 4. Their system error. Their apologies. Their very practical suggestion that 2 members of the team could share the suite on the 4th floor, which had 2 separate beds and a sitting area, and was, the front desk attendant told me, actually quite spacious. Philippa took in the situation with the calm of someone who had seen worse logistics. Teo looked alarmed, which he was still young enough to show. Kala was already answering an email. I looked at Vera. Vera was looking at the room cards in the front desk attendant's hand. She said, "Bex and I will take the suite." Not a question, not a suggestion. A decision, delivered in the tone she used when she had already run the calculation, and arrived at the only arrangement that made sense. Philippa had meetings with the client contacts, starting at 7:30 the next morning, and needed to be on the floor where those meetings were scheduled. And Teo and Kala needed their own space to finish the final data modeling, and that left us. It made sense. It was purely logical. It was the kind of decision Vera made 40 times a day, with no friction and no second guessing. I picked up my bag. The suite was at the end of the 4th floor corridor, past the ice machine and the service elevator, and the particular smell of hotel hallways that exists nowhere else in the world, disinfectant and central heating, and the faint suggestion of 100 previous guests. The suite itself was, as promised, spacious. 2 beds with white duvets, a writing desk, an armchair and a small couch. The window faced the city's industrial district, which at 8 on a Sunday evening was a field of amber lights and the distant sound of freight movement. Vera set her bag at the foot of the far bed and opened her laptop without a comment on the situation. I set mine at the foot of the near bed and made a private, personal inventory of what I was going to be doing for the next 3 days. Fine, I decided. I was going to be fine. The first day of the off-site was the kind of day that reminds you why you do this work when you are deep enough in it to have forgotten. The Revance leadership team was smart and engaged and genuinely uncertain, which was the best condition for consulting because it meant they were actually looking for answers rather than validation. Vera ran the morning session with the specific economy she brought to every room she controlled. She did not over-explain. She laid the diagnostic framework down in 3 clean moves and let the client leadership team arrive at the implications themselves, which was a more sophisticated way of delivering difficult news than most people in this business understood. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference room, Philippa fell into step beside me and said, quietly, "You watch her in rooms." I said, "I watch everyone in rooms. It is part of the job." Philippa said, and kept walking. I did not pursue the conversation. Some conversations are safer as single exchanges. We had a working dinner with the Revance team at the hotel restaurant. Good food and better conversation and the particular social engineering of an evening that needed to feel collegial without becoming informal. Vera handled it the way she handled everything social that mattered precisely, warmly in the ways that served a purpose, with the attention that made people feel they were the center of something rather than an item on a schedule. At the table, I was across from her and 1 seat down. I watched her talk to the board chair for 40 minutes, with the quality of focus she brought to the things she found genuinely interesting, and I had a private conversation with myself about the distinction between professional observation and something that had long since stopped being professional. It was a short conversation. I lost. At one point during dinner, Vera leaned slightly toward the table when making a point to the group barely perceptible. The kind of movement that happens when someone is genuinely engaged and forgets to hold themselves at professional distance, and I noticed the way the table lamp caught the edge of her watch, and I noticed, and I added it to the library without making a ceremony of it. At one point during dinner, Vera leaned slightly toward the table when making a point to the group, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that happens when someone forgets to hold themselves at professional distance, and I noticed the way the lamp caught the edge of her watch and added it to the library without making a ceremony of it. By the time we got back to the suite, it was 10:15, and I was tired in the way that only full professional days with high-stakes clients produce. I changed out of the navy blazer I had worn all day into something comfortable, made coffee at the room's machine, set my laptop on the writing desk. Vera was already at the small couch with her laptop, reviewing follow-up documentation from the board chair meeting. She had taken her jacket off and rolled her sleeves once at the forearms, the only concession to the hour she ever made in my presence. Her dark hair was still pinned. It was always pinned in professional settings. I had seen it down exactly twice in 3 years, and both times it had registered as information I did not know what to do with. We worked in comfortable silence for an hour. This was one of the things I valued about working with Vera. She had no use for performative industry. She worked and let you work, and the silence between competent people doing real work was a specific kind of peace. At some point, I pulled up the client materials from the afternoon session and moved to the couch to review them more easily. Because the writing desk chair disagreed with my spine after 40 minutes, I sat at the other end of the couch. There was appropriate professional distance between us. The appropriate professional distance lasted approximately 20 minutes. The problem was this. Vera had a tab open on her screen that contained a slide I had not seen, a version of the strategic recommendation framework, revised, with a change to the third pillar that was genuinely interesting. I leaned over to look at it. She shifted the laptop without being asked so I could see it better. I moved closer. She did not move away. I was thinking about the third pillar change, and somewhere in the process of thinking about all of those things, I stopped paying attention to where I was and how I was sitting, and I had it became apparent arranged myself in a position that could most accurately be described as sideways, on her lap. Not completely, not fully. There was a portion of my weight on the cushion beside her, and a portion that was not, and the portion that was not was resting on her thighs, which was not a configuration I had arrived at deliberately, and which I became aware of at the exact moment she went very still. A smarter person would have corrected it immediately. A person who was not 3 years into a collection of catalogued details about someone she was not going to name a feeling for. I did not correct it immediately. I said, casually, "This is better. The reframe on the third pillar." She said nothing. I said, "When did you revise it?" A silence, short, the kind that has content. She said, "Saturday morning." I said, "You worked Saturday morning." She said, "I find Saturdays useful." I said, "You find every day useful." She said, "Bex." Her voice on my name. I had been trying not to inventory the specific things that voice did to my name, and I had been failing at it the same way I failed at everything involving her. I turned my head. She was already looking at me. Not at the laptop. At me. Her face was, as always, composed. Her eyes were not doing the composed thing. They were doing something else, the thing I had seen twice in 3 years. Those moments in private where the composition still held, but the controlled distance behind it had shifted into something with a different quality entirely. She reached up and touched my chin. 2 fingers, right side. She tilted my face toward hers with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had decided to do it. The contact was light, deliberate. The way she touched things she intended to examine. "Look at me properly," she said. I looked at her properly. She looked back. 4 seconds. 5. Her eyes were gray in the lamplight, darker than they were in the conference room, and she was close enough that I could smell her cedar and something warm underneath it. The end of a long day present under the controlled surface. Her fingers were still at my jaw. Her breathing was even. Then she moved her hand away, set it on the couch cushion, looked at the laptop screen. I moved back to my end of the couch. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. The room hummed. The city moved outside the window. She scrolled to the next section of the document, and I watched my own hands type a note about the third pillar as if they belonged to someone else. We worked for another 40 minutes. When I went to bed, I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling and did the accounting. She had not pushed me off. She had made contact. She had said my name in the voice that did things to it, and then she had looked at me with those eyes and she had touched my face. And then she had returned to the document, because Vera Hollis returned to the document the way other people returned to breathing, because it was what she did, when the alternative was something she had decided she was not yet going to do. 4 seconds. 5. The weight of those seconds was unreasonable. It was a better problem to have than most problems, but it was not a comfortable one. I thought about asking her, directly. The way I asked direct things in professional settings without preamble, without the expectation that she would soften the answer. I thought about what she would say. I thought about the controlled distance and what it would mean for her to set it aside in a suite they shared because the hotel had made an error she had resolved with a single precise decision. Vera's breathing, from the other bed, was even and unrevealing. The next morning she was awake at 5:30. I know because I was awake at 5:20 and I heard the shower run and then the kitchen and then the specific quiet of someone who knew they were sharing space and was being careful about the waking of it. I stayed still and let her be careful, and at 6 o'clock I got up and we sat at the writing desk and the couch respectively and reviewed the day's agenda, and she was completely, absolutely, professionally normal. Not cold, not apologetic, just professional. The version that had a container for everything. I matched it. I was excellent at matching. I told myself, excellent at matching. The morning of day 2 had the particular quality of mornings after charged evenings when both parties have decided to behave professionally, a heightened awareness in the ordinary things. The coffee she made and left on the desk within my reach before I sat down. The way she angled her chair when we reviewed the schedule, just slightly toward me. The way people angle toward things they are paying more attention to than they intend to be visible paying. The specific sound of the chair leg on the hotel room floor. I cataloged it. I added it to the library and reviewed the morning agenda and said nothing useful about any of it. I was excellent at matching. The morning of day 2 had the particular quality of mornings after charged evenings when both parties have decided to behave professionally. The coffee she made and left on the desk within my reach before I sat down. The way she angled her chair when we reviewed the schedule, just slightly toward me. I cataloged it. I added it to the library and said nothing useful about any of it. The second day was the long one. Board presentation in the afternoon. Vera turned a defensive room into a genuine collaborative session with the specific patience and intelligence that made people trust her before they had agreed to. She was simply so specifically right, so prepared for every objection, with an answer that acknowledged it before dismantling it, that the room eventually stopped pushing and started thinking. At the mid-afternoon break, the board chair Marcus Weld, warm and politically astute, paused beside me in the hallway with his coffee and said, "She's remarkable. The way she handles a room. And you. The two of you together, there's an unusual quality. A fluency." I said. "We've worked together a long time," he said. "It shows," and went back into the session. I stood in the hallway and thought about the word fluency. He was politically astute enough to name the thing without knowing what he was naming. There was a fluency between me and Vera in professional settings, a wordless quality of calibration I had always attributed to 3 years of shared work and complementary skills, and which I was now no longer entirely sure I could keep attributing only to that. The work was genuinely good in the way work is good when two people understand each other's thinking without the translation step. Marcus Weld had been in enough rooms to know the difference between skill and something else. There was a fluency between me and Vera in professional settings, a wordless quality of calibration that I had always attributed to 3 years of shared work and complementary skills, and which I was now, in the light of the previous night's accounting, no longer entirely sure I could keep attributing only to that. The fluency was real. The work between us was genuinely good in the way that work is good when two people understand each other's thinking without the translation step. Vera set up a frame and I refined the delivery. I anticipated the gap she was about to fill. She anticipated the objection I was about to field. 3 years of practice had made it look effortless, and it was effortless, but effortless is not the same as impersonal, and Marcus Weld had been in enough rooms to know the difference. At the working dinner that evening, Marcus said something that made Vera laugh, a real laugh, not the professional courtesy one, the one I had heard approximately 6 times in 3 years, the one that showed the small lines at the corners of her eyes and changed the whole architecture of her face for a second and a half. It landed in me the way her real laughs always landed, which was without warning and in places I had not prepared. She caught my eye a second after. She looked away at her natural pace, which was slower than necessary, and faster than I wanted. Philippa, sitting beside me, said very quietly near my ear, "That laugh is not the one she uses for clients." I did not respond. She put her wine glass down and said nothing else on the subject. Back at the hotel, it was late enough that the corridor had the specific quiet of a building past its public hours. Vera and I walked from the elevator to the suite, with the particular silence of two people who were not avoiding conversation. It was not avoidance. It was something else. A charged calibration that neither of us had addressed, because addressing it would require one of us to be the first to say the word for what it was. I was not going to say it first. Not yet. Not here. I got into the suite, stood at the window and looked at the city. Vera came in and moved to the small kitchen to make tea. She brought me a cup without asking and set it on the windowsill beside me. She stood beside me and looked at the city. I said, "Thank you for the third pillar revision." She said. "The client responded to it." I said. "They did. So did I last night." A pause. She said, "I know." I looked at her. Her profile in the window light was clean and composed, and revealed nothing except the small tightening at the corner of her jaw that I had learned to read over 3 years as the sign that she was applying effort to something she would rather not be managing. I said, "Vera." She said, "Don't," not harshly, quietly, the way she said things she meant without needing to amplify them. I said, "You touched my face." She said, "I know what I did." I said, "And?" She looked at me. The composure was working harder than usual, and the working hard showed at the edges in ways only someone who had been paying attention for 3 years would notice. The jaw, the slight shift in her shoulder line. She said, "You were sitting in my lap." I said, "I know I was." She said, "To tease me." I said, "Yes." She said, "That was deliberate." I said, "Somewhat." She said. I said, "I want you to tell me what that was." The 4 seconds. Her jaw flexed. She said, "It was 4 seconds of very poor professional judgment." I said, "It didn't feel like poor judgment. It felt precise." She said nothing. The city moved below us. I said, "You are one of the most precise people I have ever worked with. Everything you do is intentional." The third pillar, revision on a Saturday morning, the suite arrangement, the tea just now. She turned. In the window light, this close, she looked like the version of herself that existed before the composure, the person the composure was built to protect. She said, "You should get some rest." I said, "I am not going anywhere. I need you to know that." She said, "I know." She moved back to the desk, the composure resettling around her like a coat picked up from a chair. I stood at the window until the tea went cool. Then I got into bed. Across the room she was still at the desk, still working. Her lamp made a small circle of amber in the dark room. Her handwriting moved across the notepad in the controlled, precise strokes of someone who was using the work as a container for something else. I recognized the behavior. I had been doing the same thing for 3 years. I closed my eyes. The ceiling fan turned. The city moved. Vera worked in the dark at the edge of the room, and I listened to the sound of her pen and thought about 4 seconds and 2 fingers on my jaw and the specific weight of a voice saying my name. I did not sleep for a long time. The third day of the offsite was the closing session. Final recommendations, implementation framework, next steps with the client team. Vera closed the engagement in a way that left the Revance team with the energy of people who had just been handed a clearer version of their own problem. They knew what to do now. They trusted us to help them do it. In the empty conference room after, Philippa came and stood beside me and said, quietly, "She has been like this since I have known her, precise and self-contained and very careful. And you have been managing your half of it since approximately your 2nd year. Careful people sometimes need someone to say the thing first, because the careful person has decided it is not their place to say it." She picked up her bag and said, "Good work this week," and walked out. Across the empty room, at the window, Vera turned. She said, "You're still here." I said, "Philippa said something interesting." She said, "Philippa often does." I said, "I would like to be the person who says it first. When we are not in a client's building." A long silence, the kind that contained multiple decisions being made simultaneously. She said, When we are back in the city. Not here, she said. And you are not going to? I said. I am not going anywhere, Vera. I told you that last night. It is the same answer this morning. The muscles in her jaw softened. Fractionally, she said. All right. In the doorway I stopped. I said, the 4 seconds. I thought about it for most of the night. She said, I know. I said, did you? A pause. The careful kind. The calculation and the honest answer briefly in competition. She said, Bex, go get your bag. The car is downstairs in 15 minutes. I went. I went because she was right, and the car was downstairs and we had professional reality between here and the thing she had just agreed to. And because she had said my name, and the way she had said it was not the answer no. It was not the answer no at all. As she passed me in the hotel lobby, she said, quietly, without slowing, the stakeholder debrief is Tuesday. You're presenting the third pillar. I said, I know. She said, wear the navy jacket. She kept walking. I stood in the lobby and thought about 3 years of details and 2 fingers on my jaw, and the specific wait of 4 seconds in lamplight. I thought about the navy jacket sitting in my wardrobe at home. The fact that she had ever registered it well enough to name it. In the car, Vera was in the front seat, reviewing her phone. But once, for less than a second, she looked up. Not at the road, not at her phone, at the rearview mirror, at me. Then she looked back at the screen. The library was getting full. I was looking forward to finding out what she planned to do about it. The drive back to the city took 3 hours. I spent most of it watching November fields go gray outside the window and telling myself that 4 weeks was a reasonable amount of time, that I had managed 3 years. 4 weeks was nothing by comparison, a controlled deceleration rather than the thing I had been doing, which was managing an indefinite situation with no terminus in sight. The terminus was now in sight. I wore the navy jacket to Tuesday's debrief. Vera opened the session and handed it to me at the 7-minute mark with the clean economy she used when she trusted the person she was handing to. I ran the third pillar presentation with the precision it deserved. At the 20-minute mark, a Revance vice president said, that third pillar framing, it's better than the off-site deck. I said, the revision came from the CEO. I refined the delivery. I did not look at Vera when I said it. I looked at the client. Afterward, Philippa fell into step beside me and said, she was watching you the whole time. I went back to my desk and worked until 6 and told myself that 4 weeks was nothing. The first weeks back had the particular texture of professional restoration after a sustained offsite. Everything that had been paused resumed, and Vera and I were in the same building, and the same meetings, and the same orbit we had occupied for 3 years. And everything was professionally fine. What was not fine was the weight of knowing. I had not known before the offsite. Or I had known in the way you know things you have decided you are not going to look at directly through peripheral vision, in the details at the edges. I was looking at it directly now. And that made the professional space we shared feel both larger and smaller than it had before. Larger because the distance between us had to be maintained with active effort. Smaller because the active effort was always visible to me in a way it had not been before. She did not change. That was the specific difficulty. Nothing in her presentation showed any evidence of a hotel suite or a ceiling fan or 2 fingers on a jaw. Nothing except the small things she could not fully hide from me. The jaw flex when I was late to a Tuesday meeting. The half-second before she answered in Thursday strategy sessions. The way she held her pen when I was talking still, in the way she held things when she was paying the kind of attention she did not want to be visible paying. I catalogued all of it, said nothing. The 3rd week back was the worst. Not because anything changed, because I had been managing things long enough to know the specific quality of tension that builds when you have agreed to a conversation that has not yet happened and you are both in the same building. Every professional exchange, carrying the weight of the thing you have agreed to say in a different setting. The Tuesday meeting, the corridor where we passed each other, and she said, quarterly deck, and I said, on your desk by noon, and neither of us slowed. I wore the navy jacket on the days I felt like being noticed and told myself 4 weeks was nothing, and then 3 weeks, and then the conference was approaching, and it was 2 weeks, and then 1, and then the Monday before. Philippa forwarded me Vera's calendar with a note that said simply, "Next week is clear after Thursday." I sent back a single word, "Understood." The annual strategy conference was a 3-day event held each November at a conference hotel in the city where the heads of half the consulting and private equity firms in the region occupied the same building for 72 hours. Vera was one of the most recognized names in attendance, not because she was the largest firm in the room but because she was the most correct one, and correctness over time accrues a specific kind of authority that scale cannot replicate. Vera keynoted the second afternoon session with a 17-minute address on organizational diagnosis and implementation failure that was, as her public addresses always were, precisely calibrated for the audience and significantly more specific than anyone in the room had expected. I watched from the second row. Not the way I had always watched her in rooms. This time I watched without the professional translation layer, without converting what I saw into the operational terms I had always used to manage the watching. I just watched her. The way she held the podium without gripping it. The way her voice filled the room without effort. The way she landed the difficult third point by building to it so precisely that the room arrived at the conclusion themselves and felt, for a moment, that they had thought of it. I had watched her do things like this for 3 years and managed to call it professional admiration. Sitting in the second row, I let it be the other thing for a full 17 minutes. When she finished, in the moment of stepping back from the podium, her eyes swept the front rows and found mine with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. 4 seconds. That number again. Then she was in conversation with the conference chair. The applause after the address was genuine and significant. She stepped back from the podium without acknowledging it the way speakers acknowledge applause. She simply moved on. Because the address was done and moving on was what she did. And in the moment of stepping back, her eyes swept the front rows and found mine with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. 4 seconds. That number again. Then, she was in conversation with the conference chair, and I was in conversation with the person beside me, and the room was reforming around the break. I thought about 4 seconds for the rest of the afternoon. The second day of the conference was the long one. Morning workshops, afternoon panels, a working lunch where I sat 3 seats from Vera and watched her do the thing she did, in rooms with the same quality of attention I had stopped pretending was only professional. At one point, across the table, she looked up mid-sentence, and her eyes moved to me with the directness of someone checking on a thing they are maintaining awareness of, the way you keep returning to a window during a storm, not because you need to, but because the not checking would feel like negligence. She looked back at the person to her left. I looked at my plate. Under the table, my hands were steady. I was excellent at making my hands steady. In the early evening of day 2, Philippa found me in the hotel corridor with 2 cups of coffee. As if she had determined through some mechanism, I had never identified exactly where I would be, and exactly when I would need it. She handed me a cup. She said, "She is going to tell you something before the Thursday close. I want you to know that so when it happens it does not catch you entirely off guard." I said, "You know what she's going to say." Philippa said, "I have known Vera for 11 years. I do not know exactly what she will say because Vera never says exactly what you expect, but I know the shape of it." She said, "She is going to tell you that she has been aware of a conflict for longer than she has been honest about. She will say it in the most structured language she has available because that is how she says difficult things. She will make it sound almost operational." I said, "And underneath the structure?" Philippa said, "Underneath the structure, it will be the truest thing she has said to another person in a very long time." She drank her coffee. She said, "I am telling you this because you are someone who reads her precisely, and I do not want the structure to make you think it is less than it is." I said, "Thank you, Philippa." She said, "Don't thank me. Just listen past the structure when it comes." She walked away. I held my coffee and looked at the corridor and thought about the shape of things. Then she finished. The applause was genuine and significant. She stepped back from the podium without acknowledging it in the way speakers acknowledge applause. She simply moved on, because the address was done, and moving on was what she did, and in the moment of stepping back, her eyes swept the front rows, and found mine with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. 4 seconds. That number again. Then she was in conversation with the conference chair, and I was in conversation with the person beside me, and the room was reforming around the break. It was during the evening reception that Dara Lim found me a senior partner at a mid-size advisory firm in town for the conference, sharp and warm and genuinely interested in what you do rather than performing interest in it. We talked for 20 minutes about organizational behavior and implementation failure. Then she said, "The address this afternoon was extraordinary. Your CEO." I said, "She's very good." She said, "You work closely with her?" I said, "I'm her associate director." "Yes." She said, "It shows. The fluency." "Someone pointed you out as the person who ran the third pillar at the Revance debrief. The framing is already being talked about in the room tonight." I said, "That framing was hers originally. I refined the delivery." She said, "You keep saying that. She gave you the frame, and you gave it the room." She tilted her glass slightly. "I'm not prying. I'm telling you that from the outside, the thing between the two of you in a professional room is visible in a way you might not be accounting for. For what it's worth, whatever it is, it produces extraordinary work, and I hope both of you know that." She excused herself gracefully, read the conversation for what it had been, and walked away to find the next one. The voice, when it came from my right, was low and level. Vera said, "Who was that?" I said, "Dara Lim." She said something worth hearing. "What?" I looked at her. In the reception light warmer, more amber than professional settings usually permitted, she looked slightly more present than the public version. Not unguarded, but present in a way that acknowledged the room was not the whole story. I said, "She said that whatever is between us in a professional room is visible. From the outside. To people who are paying attention." Vera was quiet. She said, "I have known for some time that it is not as contained as I intended it to be. That is part of why the conversation we agreed to matters." I said, 3 more days." She said, 3. She said, "I know why you came over." That landed the way honest statements from her always landed, without softening, without management, just the clean fact of it. It was the morning of day 3 that she came to find me. Not in a session. In the hotel's small auxiliary sitting room off the main lobby, the one with deep chairs and no foot traffic at 7:40 in the morning, where I had gone with my coffee for 30 minutes of quiet before the conference reconvened. She was in dark trousers and a charcoal shirt and no jacket, which for Vera, in a conference setting, was the equivalent of civilian clothes. She came in, saw me, and closed the door behind her. She said, "Do you have a few minutes?" I said, "I have 30. She sat in the chair across from mine. She put her hands in her lap, not clasped, not folded, just resting. The posture of someone who had put down a container they had been carrying for a long time. She said, "I told you the 4 seconds was poor professional judgment. That was true and also insufficient. The more accurate account is this. I have been more aware of you than is professionally defensible for longer than the offsite. What happened in the suite was not a lapse. It was the first moment in a significant period of time in which I made a decision about you that was not based on management." I said, "Management?" She said, "Managing the awareness. Managing the professional distance. Managing the way a room feels when you are in it, and the things I notice about you that have nothing to do with the work. And managing it has become increasingly difficult to distinguish from simply denying something real." I said, "How long?" A pause. She said, "Since your 2nd year. The 2nd year is when I stopped being able to attribute it to the professional category and started managing it instead." I said, "That is 4 years." She said, "Yes." I said, 4 years of very poor professional judgment." The corner of her mouth moved. She heard the echo, her own words given back to her. She said, "Yes." I said, "And instead you managed it for 4 years, and I managed it from my side, and neither of us said anything useful until I sat in your lap in a hotel room in November." She said, "That is an accurate summary." She said, "I want to tell you something else. Something that is not about the management." I waited. She said, "You asked me once, indirectly, in a hotel room window, without asking directly to say it eventually. I have been thinking about what eventually means." Whether it means the conference follow-up dinner, whether it means the cleared week, whether it means I am still using structure to defer the honest version because the honest version is harder. She looked at her hands. She said, "The honest version is this. I have known what I wanted to say to you for longer than I have been managing it. The management was not because I did not know. It was because knowing and saying are different things when you are the person with institutional authority, and the saying could change the conditions of the other person's professional life without their consent. I wanted to be very sure that when I said it, I was saying it as a person, not as the CEO." I said, "You are saying it now." She said, "I am trying to." I said, "Then keep going." She said, "I want to finish this conference with a clean professional record. I want to close Thursday afternoon and clear the calendar. And I want to have the full version of this conversation in a space that is not a hotel or a conference or a professional setting of any kind." I said, "Thursday." She said, "Thursday." She went to the door and paused with her hand on the frame. She said, "You were right, by the way. About the third pillar, the way you framed the delivery, it made the client feel they had arrived at the conclusion themselves. That is a difficult thing to engineer." I said, "I learned from someone." She said nothing. She went out. Thursday came at its own pace. The conference closed at 4. Vera ran the final roundtable with the focused precision she had brought to every hour of the 3 days. Philippa found me near the coat check afterward and said, "Good conference. I will see you Monday," said goodnight to Vera, and left. Vera came to me at 4:30 when the lobby had thinned. She said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." We walked out together, of the hotel, into the November evening together. The place she had chosen was a small restaurant, 3 streets from the conference hotel, the kind that has been in the same location for 20 years and does not make a thing of it. Low light. Good tables. The proprietor knew Vera. The ease of it, that she had been here before, that she was known here, that she had chosen this specific place for this specific evening, registered as another item for the library. We sat. For a moment neither of us said anything. The restaurant moved around us. The window showed the street, wet from a rain that had come through while we were inside finishing the conference. I said. She said, "I come here when I need to think. The proprietor doesn't ask questions." I said, "Do you need to think tonight?" She said, "I've been thinking for 4 weeks. Tonight I want to talk." She set her hands on the table. Not clasped, not folded, just resting. "Put down," she said. "I recruited you because you were the right person for the job. I want to be clear about that. The professional judgment was clean. What developed after was not something I planned or anticipated or would have described as useful. It developed the way inconvenient things develop gradually, and then in a way I could not attribute to anything except itself." I said, "The second year." She said, "The second year I understood what it was. The first year I told myself it was investment. The normal investment in a hire that is working out. By the second year, that account did not hold up under examination, and I made the choice to manage it rather than to examine what managing it was costing." I said, "And what was it costing?" She said, "The effort of it, the daily maintenance of the distance, the decisions I had to run through an extra filter because I could not be certain whether I was making them for the work or for something else. Like the third pillar revision on a Saturday. Like knowing your coffee order before you told me. Like the suite arrangement when the hotel overbooked. Those were not purely professional decisions." I said, "I know they weren't. I have a library, Vera." She looked at me. I said, 3 years of small things. The things you thought you were keeping contained. I have been collecting them since your second year too." A silence. The restaurant worked around us. Someone at a near table laughed at something. She said, "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you badly enough to turn it into a management problem for 4 years, which is not a thing I am proud of, and the management has cost you things it should not have cost you, the distance you had to maintain from your side. The professional translation layer. The version of this job where the person you work most closely with cannot tell you the truth about something this significant. That is a real cost, and it was mine to pay, and I made you pay it instead. And I am sorry for that specifically. I looked at her. I was, for the first time in 3 years, without a response I had prepared. I had thought about this conversation. I had turned it over at the ceiling in hotel rooms, and at the desk late in the office, and in the car on the drive back from the offsite. I had imagined many versions of it. I had not imagined it arriving this directly. I said, "Vera," she said, "I know it is a great deal to absorb." I said, "I am not struggling to absorb it. I am sitting with the fact that you just said the thing." She said, "I said the thing." I said, "You said the entire thing, in one speech." She said, "I had 4 weeks to prepare it." I said, "I know you did. I watched you prepare it. It was visible, the preparation. In the Tuesday meetings, and the Thursday sessions and the conference. The jaw," she said. "What about the jaw?" I said. "When you are applying significant effort to something, the jaw does a thing. A very small thing. I have been cataloging it since approximately your 2nd year." She was quiet. Then she said, "You should have told me." I said, "I know. I didn't, because the version of this where I said it first and you used the professional distance to step back from it was something I could not afford. So I waited." She said, "I would not have stepped back." I said, "I know that now. I did not know it then." A silence. Honest and not uncomfortable. I said, "I have been in love with you since the 2nd year too. Possibly before. The 2nd year is when I stopped being able to call it something else." She said nothing. She looked at me with those clear eyes, the composure present and real, and entirely in service of her now, rather than hiding her. I said, "The 2 times I saw your hair down, twice in 3 years, and both times it registered as information I didn't know what to do with," she said. "And now?" I said, "I know what to do with it." We ordered food and ate it, and the conversation moved through the things conversations move through, when 2 people who have known each other for 3 years are finally speaking the language they have always had available, and choosing not to translate it. We talked about the 2nd year and the 3rd year and the particular loneliness of managing something real by yourself when the person it involved was 20 feet away. She asked me about the library. I told her about the library. She listened with the focused attention she brought to the things she found most interesting. At one point she said, "The stakeholder debrief, the Tuesday, you said I gave you the frame and you gave it the room." I said, "It was true." She said, "The particular way you said it, in front of the client. I thought about it for 3 days." I said, "Good." She said, "You meant for me to—" I said, "Somewhat." The corner of her mouth moved. The full millimeter. The one I had been cataloging longest. We left the restaurant at 8:30. The street was still wet. The city was doing its November evening thing, cold, close. The particular light of the city in the dark that exists nowhere else. We stood on the pavement outside, and the night was cold enough to make the breath visible. She said, "Walk with me." We walked. Not toward anything in particular. Just the city, the wet pavements, the lights in the rain's aftermath. We talked, and then were quiet. And the quiet was the kind that has been earned. At some point she stopped walking. I stopped beside her. We were on a quiet street 2 blocks from the restaurant, in the part of the city where the commercial district gives way to something older. A bookshop with its lights still on. The reflection of a street lamp in a puddle. The distant sound of traffic 2 blocks east. She was looking at me in the way I had been letting myself look at her for the last hour, without the translation layer, without the professional management, just directly. The composure was real and present and not a wall. She was looking at me in the way I had been letting myself look at her for the last hour, without the translation layer, without the professional management, just directly. The composure was real and present and not a wall. She reached up. Her hand was at my jaw, not 2 fingers this time, the full, warm press of her palm, deliberate and certain. She tilted my face toward hers the way she had tilted it in the hotel suite, with the same economy of movement, and this time she did not look at the document after. She kissed me. Not urgent, not frantic, patient in the way things are patient when they have waited long enough to stop rushing. Her other hand settled at my waist, not a claim, not a question, just the fact of being there. I had one hand at the lapel of her coat and the other against the side of her face, and the November city moved around us, and neither of us moved for a long time. When she pulled back, it was just enough to look at me with those gray eyes close up, with no professional distance, with the unmanaged version of the thing she had been managing for 4 years. I said, "That was not poor professional judgment." She said, "No. That was something else entirely." I said, "What was it?" She said, "I think you know." I said, "I want to hear you say it." She said, "It was the thing I should have done sooner, and the beginning of something I intend to do considerably better." I said, "That is a very structured way to say a simple thing." She said, "I am a very structured person." I said, "Are you going to keep working with me?" She said, "I think we need to tell Philippa. Talk to the firm's counsel. The honest account is that we cannot work in the same direct reporting line." I said, "Are you ready for that conversation?" She said, "I have been preparing for it since this morning. Philippa already knows the shape of it. The council will know by Monday." I said, "And after that?" She said, "After that, whatever this is, it exists without a professional frame around it, which is the only version of it I am willing to accept." I said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 6 years." She said, "I'm working on a better average." We walked back through the city. She was still close, closer than the professional distance, by deliberate millimeters that had nothing to do with professional distance anymore. The city was doing what cities do on cold November nights. Indifferent, relentless, beautiful in the particular way that cities are beautiful when you are walking through them with someone who has just said the thing you have been waiting 4 years to hear. I said, "I forgive the 4 years." She looked at me. I said, "I mean it. I am not holding it against you. You managed it the only way you knew how to manage it, and the management was also why the work was as good as it was, and I can hold both of those things at once." She said, "That is more generous than I deserve." I said, "It is exactly what you deserve. It is what the full accounting says." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought about you in the parking structure in November. When I told you to wear the navy jacket, I thought about it on the drive home. I thought it was the most professionally irresponsible thing I had done in 6 years." I said, "It was," she said. "And?" I said, and I looked at that jacket for a long time before I went to sleep. The corner of her mouth, the full millimeter. We walked back through the city. She was still close, closer than the professional distance, by deliberate millimeters that had nothing to do with professional distance anymore. I said, "I forgive the 4 years. I mean it. You managed it the only way you knew how, and the management was also why the work was as good as it was, and I can hold both of those things at once." She said, "That is more generous than I deserve." I said, "It is exactly what you deserve." She was quiet. Then she said, "I thought about the parking structure. When I told you to wear the navy jacket, I thought it was the most professionally irresponsible thing I had done in 6 years." I said, and I looked at that jacket for a long time before I went to sleep. The corner of her mouth, the full millimeter. We walked back through the city and talked about the structure, the reporting changes, the timeline, the specific steps that would make the professional context clean and honest. She was, as she was in every conversation where decisions needed to be made, precise and prepared, and unafraid of the cost. I was not afraid of the cost either. I had been paying it quietly for 4 years. The version where the cost went toward something real was not a burden. It was an accounting that finally made sense. The structure was clean by the end of the following week. A realignment of my reporting relationship, my role remained, broadened. Reporting through Philippa, rather than directly to Vera. The firm's counsel confirmed the disclosure was appropriately handled. Just the honest administrative work of making the professional reality match what was actually true. Philippa came out of Vera's office Monday morning, found me at my desk, and said, "You should know the conversation went well." I said, "I know how she handles things." Philippa said, "Yes, I suspect you do," and went back to her office with the satisfied air of someone whose 11-year investment had finally paid the expected return. On the Friday of that week, I was at my desk at 6:30 in the evening when I heard footsteps in the corridor. She came to the doorway and leaned against the frame, with her jacket over her arm and the collar of her shirt open for the first time in any professional setting I had ever seen her in. She said, "Do you want to get dinner?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Not the Thai place by the office and not anywhere with a client connection." I said, "Are you describing a date, Vera?" She said, "I am describing dinner with specific parameters." I said, "Those parameters describe a date." The jaw was doing nothing. The shoulder was doing nothing. The precise, controlled machinery of her composure was present and genuine and entirely at rest. She said, "Yes." I closed the laptop and got my coat. We went to a place with good food and no one who knew either of our names in a business context. It was the kind of restaurant that exists in every city and is difficult to find. No particular reputation, no design concept, just good food in a room where the acoustics allowed conversation and the lighting was somewhere between ambient and honest. She was already there when I arrived. I had not expected that. Vera was, in professional settings, the person who arrived after everyone else because the room always recalibrated around her arrival. Here she was sitting at a corner table, with her coat on the chair beside her, and her phone face down on the table, which was the most civilian thing I had ever seen her do. She saw me. She did not wave. She just waited, the way she waited for things she intended to stay for. I sat down across from her. It was the kind of restaurant that exists in every city and is difficult to find. No particular reputation, no design concept, just good food, in a room where the acoustics allowed conversation, and the lighting was somewhere between ambient and honest. She was already there when I arrived. I had not expected that. Vera was, in professional settings, the person who arrived after everyone else, because her time was the most valuable and her presence the most consequential, and the room always recalibrated around her arrival. Here she was, sitting at a corner table with her coat on the chair beside her, and a glass of water in front of her, and her phone face down on the table, which was the most civilian thing I had ever seen her do. She saw me. She did not wave. She just waited, the way she waited for things she intended to stay for. I sat down across from her. We sat across from each other and talked about things that had nothing to do with deliverables and everything to do with the people we were when the professional frame was absent. She was funny in ways the office never showed. She had opinions about the city's architecture that were specific and occasionally unpredictable. She drank her wine at a pace that suggested she had genuinely put the clipboard down. At the end of the evening, she paid the check before I could reach for it. I said, "I could have done that." She said, "I know. I wanted to." On the pavement outside, she looked at me with the expression I was learning to recognize as the one she used when she was fully present in a moment without managing it. I said, "I have been watching you in rooms for 3 years and I have never once been able to pretend it was purely professional. Not once." She said, "I know." I said, "How long have you known I couldn't pretend?" She said, "Since the 2nd year." Roughly the same time I stopped pretending myself. I said, "We wasted a significant amount of time." She said, "We built an exceptional professional relationship." I said, "We did both things." She said, "Yes, we did." I said, "I think the second thing is going to be better." She looked at me, the gray eyes, steady and unmanaged, the corner of her mouth, that full millimeter. She said, "Evidence suggests." We started having dinner every week. Not on any fixed night. She was not a woman who needed routine for the things that mattered to her. She was a woman who needed intention, and the dinners were always intentional, always chosen rather than scheduled. She texted me on Tuesdays and Thursdays the way she had always sent messages about work direct. No preamble, except the subject was the restaurant she had found, or the neighborhood she wanted to walk through, or the film she had read about that she thought I might find interesting. I thought I might find interesting. Not we, not you, might enjoy. I thought you might find it interesting. Which was the most Vera thing she had ever said to me outside a professional context, and which I filed in the library alongside everything else. We started having dinner every week. She was not a woman who needed routine for the things that mattered to her. She needed intention. And the dinners were always intentional. She texted me the way she had always sent messages about work direct. No preamble except the subject was the restaurant she had found, or the neighborhood she wanted to walk through, or the film she thought I might find interesting. I thought I might find interesting, not you might enjoy, which was the most Vera thing she had ever said to me outside a professional context. We were seen at the conference follow-up dinner 2 weeks later. We came together, sat beside each other, and the conversation flowed the way it always flowed, the particular fluency Marcus Weld had named, and Dara Lim had named, and Philippa had been watching for 11 years. The difference was that neither of us was translating it anymore. At the end of the dinner, the partner to my right said quietly, "Whatever changed, it suits her." I said, "I'll tell her you said so." Vera was at the door waiting. She had her coat on. She was looking at me with the same absolute attention she had always brought to the things she found most worth watching. I crossed the room. She held the door. We walked out together into the city, and neither of us flinched at the light. And the light felt like something that was simply there, not a spotlight, not a weight, not a professional setting requiring management. Just the city. November. Just two people who had finally, at considerable cost, gotten around to the honest version of the thing they had both known since the second year. Worth it.